Well, good evening to all of you. Let me thank Naval for that very warm, overly generous introduction to me. A very special thanks to Agnello, who we were students together, as he pointed out, many, many years ago at the college. And it's a wonderful experience for me to come back here because these were my formative years. I tell people often that the Salesians in Don Bosco taught me how to read, and the Jesuits at St. Xavier's College taught me how to think. And I must tell you, I spent more hours in the library and the canteen than the classrooms. This is not, I don't want you to follow my example. But I found the library and the canteen to be so stimulating in terms of allowing us to think about the world that we were entering. And the education that I got here, of course, was second to none. I'm going to speak today about a topic that appears in the headlines, but often does not convey the complexity that it embodies. And so what I want to do is give you a tutorial that will focus on two things simultaneously. I want to talk about geopolitics and how to think of the world through the lens of geography. And then I want to use that as a foundation to tell you how at least the United States thinks about its relationship with India. This is not the kind of stuff that policymakers generally express because it's too abstract. But it's important to understand it because it's really the foundation on which a lot of the colloquial language of policy expresses itself. So I'm going to first spend a few minutes giving you literally a classroom tutorial on classical geopolitics. And I'm going to start with that map out there, which, if you look at, is sort of strange in terms of how it appears. We are all used to the projection of the world called the Mercator projection, which is the projection that you see very often in maps that are displayed. And what the Mercator projection sort of does is that it takes a round Earth and puts it on a flat plane. And with the result, it ends up distorting both geographic relationships, the sizes of countries, and their structural connections. And so what I've done here is actually moved away from the Mercator projection to something called a Mollywig projection, and I've distorted the projection. What the Mollywig projection does is it's an equal area projection. So this is an accurate rendition of relative sizes of countries. There's no distortion with respect to size. So you will see Greenland actually quite small compared to a Mercator map where Greenland sort of dominates the northern hemisphere. But it distorts the spatial relationships in a way that is very useful. And I've done it for a particular purpose. Now, there was a geographer in the early 20th century called Sir Halford Mackinder, who wrote an essay that was actually quite revolutionary, because what he wanted to do was to help people think not of flat maps, but of what he called the round Earth. And this captures the image of the round Earth. And what Halford Mackinder said was that he said, you've got to think of the Earth as having two gigantic terrestrial bodies, and around which all politics sort of resolves. And the two bodies were first this body of land, which, if you actually look at it in this way, looks like a unified whole. It looks like a compact landmass. And he called this body of land the world island. And if you look at it, it does have the appearance of an island sort of floating in an ocean space. And what lies outside the world island, these islands, which is the North and South Americas, and of course Australia and other islands sort of on the periphery, he called these the outlying islands. These were the outlying islands, and this was the world island. And he was writing at a time when modern politics was in considerable ferment. So the first essay was written in 1904, 1905. And he was trying to help people understand a very simple proposition. And that simple proposition was this. He was basically saying, when you look at the world island, this is really where the action in global politics is. And at that time, the action, of course, was concentrated in this part of the world island, because Europe was the center of the universe. There was a struggle that was taking place between a rising Germany and Great Britain. It would take the form of two world wars, eventually bringing the United States, which was in the outer islands, into the world island, and so on and so forth. So what he was trying to communicate to his readers was that if you want to understand the future of global politics, you've got to understand certain geographic relationships and focus on the world island, because that's extremely important. Now, he introduced two other concepts. So you have the world island, which is the first concept that you want to keep in mind. And then he introduced two other concepts. The second concept was the concept of the heartland. And he called this part of the world island, roughly the part that today is dominated by Russia, he called that the heartland. And at that time, this was long before global warming became a reality, his simple point about the heartland was this: it's a part of the world which cannot be accessed through sea power, because it was huge in terms of land, and the most powerful fleets could only sort of trouble it on the periphery. But they could not trouble the core power that was located in this part of the world called the heartland. And remember, this was a period of time when all these were frozen wastes, where sea power could not actually operate in the Arctic and threaten the heartland from the north. So he said, pay attention to the heartland. And in Mackinder's view, the heartland was critical, because his argument, speaking now to the British government of the day and the British Empire of the time, was that if you do not find ways of defending yourself against the heartland, the power of the heartland will be used to dominate all of Western Europe. And if Western Europe falls to the forces of the heartland, whoever occupies the heartland will be able to amass so much international power that that international power could in turn be used to then threaten the outlying islands. That was the essence of his thesis. And so he developed three categories to tell the story: the world island and the outlying islands, that's category 1; the heartland, which is category 2; and the third geographic factor that he flagged was these areas which were on the periphery, which he called the rimland. And in Mackinder's worldview, the rimland was somewhat peripheral. The story was the heartland, the capture of the heartland by whoever occupied this part of the universe, and the use of the heartland's power to then threaten the peripheries. That is the story. A few decades after Mackinder, there was a second great geopolitical theorist, actually a Dutch-American called Nicholas Spikeman. And Nicholas Spikeman was writing at the time of the Second World War. So Mackinder wrote in 1905. Nicholas Spikeman was writing from 1942 to 1945. And Spikeman was an American. And Spikeman sort of tweaked Mackinder's thesis. So he accepted the broad characterization of the world island, the heartland and the rimland, the outlying islands and so forth. But Spikeman changes the structuring of Mackinder and almost turns it on his head. And what Spikeman says is that yes, you have to pay attention to the heartland, because that is an enormous concentration of natural resources. And if those natural resources come under the control of a single power, it can threaten other parts of the globe. All true. But the key is not so much the heartland, the key is going to be the rimlands. Because if you get sufficient countervailing power in the rimlands can actually box the heartland in and prevent the heartland from using the power that it accumulates to bring to bear against both these peripheries as well as the outlying islands. Now remember, Spikeman is writing for an American audience. And he is writing for an American audience at the time of the Second World War with a very specific intention. He wants to tell US policymakers that they cannot be indifferent to the politics of the world island. He's writing at a time that the United States had come out of isolationism, but he wanted to sort of drive the point home by saying that you can't come out of isolationism simply because there is a current threat. You have to come out of isolationism permanently, because if you don't, what's going to happen in this part of the world is going to have terrific consequences for your own security here. And so what Spikeman is essentially telling US policymakers is that you have to be involved in the fights and in the affairs of Europe. You have to be involved in the struggles that are occurring on the periphery, because it is in American national interest to make certain that there is a permanent balance of power that is maintained in this part of the world. Now that teaching, which comes from Spikeman, becomes really the foundation for US geopolitical thinking ever since. And so when you think of US foreign policy, and if you think of US grand strategy, the first principle of US grand strategy has been to make sure that there is a balance of power in the Eurasian landmass in order to prevent a hegemony from rising in this part of the world that could mobilize the resources that are found in this part of the world and then use those resources to threaten the outlying islands, whether those be Japan, Australia, or the Americas. In other words, what Spikeman did in a contribution that informs American strategic thinking to this day was that he put the debate about isolationism versus engagement not just as a political fashion. It was not just a political debate which was occurring because of the fashions of the day, but he was trying to tell them that that debate is actually anchored in permanent geographic realities which are not going away. And the essence of his message was the United States does not have the luxury of being indifferent to what happens in this part of the world. We have to use the power that we have as an outlying island to find allies here and work with allies here to make certain that if ever a heartland power arises, that heartland power cannot overwhelm its neighbors in ways that will allow it to then amass power and threaten the world outside of continental Asia. That's the foundation. Now for that reason, the United States since 1900 went to war 3 times in Asia. Right? So in the first war, the First World War, what the United States did was there was a rimland power called Germany, which was essentially threatening the rest of the countries in this part of the rimland and threatening the heartland. And so the United States, with allies like Great Britain, like France, goes to war to prevent this rimland power from essentially taking over this entire European promontory and eventually Russia. In the Second World War, it's a repeat of the same story. And the objective is use peripheral countries that exist on the periphery of the threatening state and then box that threatening state from becoming too big. Right? So that's in the first phase. I think of World War I and World War II as really one phase of geopolitical competition because they're really 2 parts of the same crisis. right? It's managing the rise of German power. Whether it's Wilhelmine Germany or Hitler's Germany, it's really the same thing, with a 10-year pause in between. Then you get the second phase. And the second phase is dealing with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And now the tables are sort of reversed. Whereas in the first phase, the threat arose from the rimland to the heartland, which is Germany threatening west and east. In the second phase, it's the Soviet Union, the heartland, now threatening the peripheries. And what the United States does is pretty much the same thing, which is partners with peripheral powers in Europe and in Asia, boxes the Soviet Union in a 70-year Cold War, and makes certain that the Soviet Union cannot dominate all of Asia, cannot dominate Europe, and thereby preserves that balance of power that protects the United States. We are now in the third phase. And the third phase is interesting because once again, the model is reversed. You have the rise of China. And the rise of China, which is a rimland power because it sort of lives on the peripheries of Asia, a rimland power that is now rising, that once again holds the potential, its potential, of becoming big enough to dominate all of Asia, dominate all of Europe, if it succeeds, and then unifying this entire space to potentially then threaten the United States in the outer islands. So when you think of US-China competition, which is very much in the headlines now, there are fights in economics, there are fights over trade, there are fights over strategy, and so on and so forth. I want you to think not about just the headlines, because the headlines are sort of interesting, but the deep structural factors that are shaping this competition. And the deep structural factor that is shaping this competition is once again the American fear that a rising China will begin to mobilize its resources, begin to build up a network of allies all around the Asian periphery, and eventually use that power to threaten American interests in Asia and ultimately around the world. That's the essence of the geopolitical competition. But China is fascinating in a way that the Soviet Union never was. And there are two reasons for why it is fascinating and extremely complicated from the point of view of the United States. So let me tell you the fascinating part first. The fascinating part is that China's reach today, so when you think of the Soviet Union, right, the reach of the Soviet Union was primarily towards Europe and primarily towards, to a certain degree, in Japan. But Soviet power, for all its fearsomeness, really was not global power. Because the funny thing about the Soviet Union, even though it was militarily very powerful, was that it was actually economically very weak. In fact, at the height of Soviet power in 1975, the Soviet Union never exceeded 45% of America's GNP, which meant that even though the Soviet Union looked so formidable in military terms, it was a sort of a humanoid with a very large head, but a very short body. And its economic foundations were relatively very weak. So when you were talking of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, that competition, looking at it in hindsight, could go in only one direction. It could go only in the direction of Soviet defeat. Because you could not compete with the United States, which was essentially twice your size. Okay. China is an entirely different story. For the first time, we are looking at China today at about 60% or 70% of the size of the US economy. Depending on where China goes, it could reach parity with the US economy, if not exceed it in size. So if there is a future US-China competition that is significant, it will be significant because for the first time, it will be a rivalry between two relatively equal-sized powers. And we have not really seen a bipolar competition between two relatively equally sized powers for a long time in the modern period. So that's one fascinating element about China. There's a second fascinating element about China. If China begins to dominate the Eurasian landmass as many Americans feel, it will not be an engagement that will be restricted to Europe or to the Middle East or to Southeast Asia in a way that the Soviets did. It will be an engagement that actually covers the entire world island. And China, for example, has now developed the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an effort to recreate the old maritime Silk Road, both in its maritime dimensions as well as in its continental dimensions. And what the Maritime Silk Road is a Chinese effort to invest in infrastructure that would once again link China all the way across Central Asia to Europe as the old traditional trade routes once upon a time unfolded. And in the same way, there's a maritime angle where China wants to build a network of maritime connections that will connect it to the Indian subcontinent by sea, connect it to Southeast Asia by sea, and then eventually touch the Pacific, the African continent as well. So the spatial reach of Chinese engagement will be far more dramatic than the spatial reach of the Soviet Union in a previous era. So when you think of Chinese engagement in these terms, we are looking at the possibility of a Chinese sphere of influence that will not involve simply continental Asia, but that will involve all the peripheries of continental Asia and ultimately Africa as well. So Mackinder's worst nightmare, that you could have a single power resident in Eurasia becoming powerful enough to influence and shape the politics and the economics of this part of the world, and then amass that power to challenge the United States and its security, however far afield it may be. There is a real risk that Mackinder's worst nightmare comes true. And so when the US thinks about geopolitics, it is this framing of the problem that shapes the calculations of American decision makers. Now, I want to talk about the rise of China for a few minutes to give you a feel for why that has become such an interesting challenge. China historically was always a great country, but it was a country that always looked within itself. It was not a country that went out into the world as, say, the great European colonial powers. And there was a reason for that. The reason China was inward-looking was because the Chinese had to perpetually deal with three sets of problems. The first set of problems were a very, very porous border to the north. Now, if you look at the Great Wall, which the Chinese built over centuries, the reason they built the Great Wall somewhere along this path was precisely because they wanted to keep the barbarians from the steppes from coming southwards into China. So there was always a landward threat that China had to deal with. And as long as there was a landward threat, the threat from the steppes, China could not afford to think of engagements outside its own periphery. The second challenge that the Chinese always had to worry about was succession challenges within the state. Because every time there was a new dynasty, the new dynasty had to deal with the remnants of the old dynasty. They had to fend off challengers for power, and so on and so forth, right? So you have this whole business of succession crises at the time of dynasties, and it took a lot of energy. And the third were the threats of internal disorder. China has always had perennial problems of internal disorder. And if you look at the things that worry the Chinese today more than anything else, it's the threats of internal disorder within. In fact, it's fascinating. You know, people talk about the Chinese defense budget as having grown dramatically in the last, say, 15 years. The Chinese defense budget is somewhere about 60% of the US defense budget today. And everyone looks at the growth of that defense budget over the last 15 years, and you begin to get nervous because the chart, you know, the arrows sort of go in a certain direction. But if you look at the Chinese budget for internal security, the Chinese internal security budget is far greater than the budget for external defense. So even though the external defense budget has been growing, the bigger budget, which doesn't get attention, especially in the West, is the internal security budget. And that tells you something about the leadership's fears of domestic disorder. Now, so when we think about these three challenges, domestic disorder, succession crises, and threats from the North, for the first time, after many, many years, we find that the Chinese leadership is in a position where it can mitigate each one of these three crises, right? So today, both by various forms of economic co-optation as well as various forms of surveillance, the Chinese state has managed to keep threats of domestic disorder under control. And it has done it in quite amazing ways through the exploitation of technology, right? So we are likely to see, for the first time, a highly sophisticated Leninist surveillance state that will use artificial intelligence, that will use all the things that, you know, all of us use, like cell phones, and so on and so forth, in a grid that will allow the Chinese state to monitor the behavior of its own citizens. So the first threat of domestic disorder, that threat has been sort of at least contained. The second threat is the threat of succession crises. And today, what Xi Jinping has managed to do, he has managed to limit the threats posed by succession crises within the Communist Party. In fact, we now see Xi Jinping, the rise of a new Chinese leader with a stature that matches Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Someone who really has concentrated an extraordinary amount of power in himself, who has actually managed to enshrine what is called Xi Jinping thought in the Chinese political canon, and who believes that he is truly one of the great men in Chinese history who will help China rejuvenate itself as a new nation. And the third part, which is very interesting from a foreign policy point of view, is that China today does not have any threats from the North. Throughout the Cold War, one of the things that kept Chinese leaders up nights was the threats posed by the Soviet Union. Today, Chinese-Russian relations are so incredibly good that China today can afford to look with confidence outside without having to fear about threats from the region. So the three historic factors that boxed China in and kept it inward looking, those three historic factors have disappeared. And there is, of course, a fourth reality, which is a reality made by American power after 1945, and that is globalization, right? Globalization was produced as a result of liberal American thinking after 1945, when the United States decided to, after it won the Second World War, to create this new experiment. And this new experiment was called a liberal trading regime. And it started out first with the International Trade Organization, that evolved into GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and that evolved into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And what was the essence of this project? The essence of this project was the United States would build a global trading system where everyone traded with one another, And the theory was, if everyone traded with one another, it would increase prosperity. And if it increased prosperity, it would inevitably lead to the spread of democracy and the promotion of peace. This is quintessential liberal beliefs about international politics, right? And so the United States, after it won the Cold War, actually made an incredible decision, which it did not make during the Cold War period. And what is that? During the Cold War period, America was steadily expanding the global trading system. But it was expanding the global trading system only for its friends. So if you look at the trading system as it evolved post-45, it was essentially a Western-dominated trading system. And it begins with America's allies in Europe and American allies in Asia. Towards the end of the Cold War, it expands to bring countries in Southeast Asia who were not formal American allies. And if the United States was a Machiavellian power, it would have stopped right there. It would have said, we've got all the countries that we want to strengthen and enrich who are within our sphere of influence. They're all our trading partners. Let's stop right here, right? But in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, American liberalism, American optimism, and American hubris, remember we had just won the Cold War, and we stood there alone, and we stood there completely confident that there was no power out there on the horizon who could ever challenge us. And in that moment, we made the remarkable decision to bring China, which until that point was not in the global trading system, into the global trading system. And so we gave China permanent trading status. China joins the WTO, and China becomes a trading country. American capital begins to move into China. European capital, Japanese capital begins to move into China. And before you know it, China becomes a manufacturing powerhouse. And the consequences of that transformation are consequences that all of us feel. So it was a dramatic change in China. 300 million people taken out of poverty within a generation. 40 years of double-digit growth, historically unparalleled in our development experience. No one has grown as fast as China has in the last 40 years, right? All this because China becomes part of a global trading system, and the Chinese state uses its investments in its human capital to build up a manufacturing base that replaces the United States as the manufacturer to the world. So when you think of manufacturing, it's gone through three phases. There was once, Great Britain was the workshop of the world. As the 19th century went into the 20th century, the United States was the workshop of the world. From the 20th century into the 21st century, that transition has now taken place into China. And so China has now become a serious economic partner and a serious economic challenger, right? So that's the story of the world as we see it now. And as we look out into the horizon, we see that Chinese manufacturing, Chinese entrepreneurism, and Chinese, the vision that China has of itself, will inevitably take it outside the Asia that it was locked in for 500 years. This is inevitable and it is natural, right? But the fact that it is inevitable and natural does not mean that everyone sleeps well at night. Because when you think of a rising China with incredible power, with incredible influence, you begin to imagine dangers to your security. And this is the evolution that the United States has come to now, where it is cheering Chinese success. We have benefited as a result of China's success, but we also are beginning to recognize that there is a shadow that accompanies Chinese success. And that shadow is more and more resources being used to build instruments of war rather than simply focusing on development. And this is the fundamental difference between the post-1945 to 1991 world and the post-1991 world. Now, in the 1945 to 1991 world, there were many countries that grew as a result of partnering in the US trading system, Western Europe and Japan, right? Those are great examples. War-torn countries came back into the global system as manufacturing powerhouses. For a while there, the United States was a little nervous. And if you remember in the 1980s, there were many in the United States who were worried that Japan would now become a new great power competitor and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, those concerns sort of diminished. Because when you looked at Japan, they were manufacturing better automobiles, better television sets, better electronics. But they did not use their accumulated economic surplus to build machines of war that would challenge the United States. The same was true for Western Europe. They grew, they developed, but they didn't use the economic surplus to build machines of war to challenge us. With China, that's not true. China is growing, China is developing, but China is allocating a substantial amount of resources to build the instruments of war that one day will challenge the United States. And how do we know this? We know this because we have objective disagreements with China all around Asia. We have objective disagreements over Taiwan. We have objective disagreements about Japan. We have objective disagreements about the South China Sea. And we are now slowly coming to the point where we are beginning to have disagreements with China about the Indian Ocean. And in some ways, if you're sitting in Beijing, what China is doing is completely natural, right? Because if you are Chinese and you have 40 years of an economic tailwind behind you, you've got double-digit growth, why shouldn't you be doing this? So what the Chinese are doing is not necessarily unnatural. It just happens to be a natural thing that undermines American interests. So one needs to avoid being moralistic when one thinks about these challenges, right? This is a great power. It has now looked at its capabilities and it wants its place in the sun. Except that there is already another star out there, with a huge mass and which is potentially threatened by the rise of this new China. So, what does all this have to do with US-India relations? Actually everything. Because when we look at the world in the way that I described it, right? And you begin to ask yourself as a strategist, what can I do to make certain that Chinese power does not begin to undermine my core interests, right? I'm sitting in Washington and I have a map that looks similar to this and I have to start thinking about, I want a good relationship with China because I trade with them. I have deep economic ties with them. But I can't sleep easily because this China is not like Japan. This China is not like Germany. It's not an ally of the United States. So I have to think in terms of that old logic that Mackinder and Spikeman constantly reminded me about, which is the only way you protect power that grows out of the world island from threatening you in the outer spaces is to make certain that there is a balance of power within the world island itself. That's the logic. It's the only peaceful way we know to preserve an equilibrium in Asia that does not end up threatening our interests. Now, luckily for us, there is another country that thinks the same way. That's the country I'm standing in. There are others who also think this way, but they have liabilities, right? So, the Japanese think this way. But the problem with Japan is that it's an island nation. And one of the things we know is that water has a peculiar property. It stops the easy projection of power. Land, different matter. That's why when you have land borders with people who threaten you, you get a lot more nervous. If there are water spaces that threaten you, if there are water spaces that divide you from countries that threaten you, you can be a lot more relaxed. And so even though Japan thinks about the importance of balancing Chinese power, it's too small and it's got water in between. Now the ideal country to keep the Chinese occupied, distracted, and a little nervous would be this country to the north, Russia. If we could somehow poison the water in Moscow and get the Russians to start thinking of the Chinese as competitors, the United States would be home free. Because then it would be going back to the old world, where Russian and Chinese anxieties suffice to balance each other. The problem we have is that the Russians are actually at this point in a very, very frosty mood vis-a-vis the United States. Because Russian policy today towards the United States is conducted through the prism of 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you can understand Russia's animus, right? Because we ran this Cold War with the Russians for 70 years. We defeated them. We caused the collapse of the former Soviet Union. We destroyed the old Soviet empire. We expanded NATO in the process. That made the Russians extremely nervous. And so it's not surprising to me that whoever holds power in Moscow today does not exactly look at the United States as a benign entity with whom they want to be best friends. And someone like Putin, who has a real both anxieties and animus towards Washington, finds that the policy that he wants is to find a way to reconstruct Russian hegemony in Asia. And so, to construct Russian hegemony in Asia requires him to find friends who can make that possible. And there's only one great friend that he can find, and that's right here. And so, the one country that ideally the United States would have loved to peel away from China, which is Russia, is the one country that we cannot engage with in a way that we would like. So you go around the map and you start looking more closely, right? And you look at Europe, and you see Europe, which is still a very powerful concentration of capabilities, but deeply internally divided. And certainly a Europe that is today also deeply intertwined with China in terms of economics and trade. So this is not a Europe that is going to go rushing to the fences to fight America's fights with China. We're going to have to manage how we manage the European-Chinese relationship, but the expectation that you can rely all too easily on Europe to essentially balance the Chinese, I think that is an illusion. Right? So you go around, you go to the Middle East, and you can sort of forget the Middle East in a microsecond because they simply don't have the capabilities to think about China. Which brings us to this country out here. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm sitting in a basement in Washington and moving chess pieces on a board and saying, aha, I have found the checkmate, right? That piece is in me. I wish I could do it. I can't. The good news for the United States is that India has its own issues with China. Right? And India, too, is a country that's rising. I always have to remind people that when you think of the rise of Asia, yes, there was a Japan. Yes, there was a South Korea. Yes, in later years, there was a Singapore. But don't forget, now we also have an India. And luckily for us, India has its own anxieties about China. These were not anxieties that we created. Though believe me, if you didn't have those anxieties, I would be in the business of creating them. But we don't have to work that hard because India has its own challenges vis-a-vis China. And when India looks out at the universe, India sees a China that has become extremely powerful. I would have shown you graphs if I was teaching a class here. If you look at the size of the Indian economy and the Chinese economy just as recently as 1980, okay? The two economies almost touch each other in terms of size. If you project the graph from 1980 to 2019, the Chinese economy is 5 times larger than that of the Indian economy. So, from our point of view, China gives India heartburn for reasons of simple disparities in strength. And then China has made certain choices over the last 30 odd years with respect to partnering with Pakistan, increasingly beginning to penetrate South Asia itself, relations with Nepal, relations with Sri Lanka, relations with Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. India watches these with a certain wariness. Because India, like all great powers, wants to have peripheries that are completely sanitized. Remember the British Raj? The British Raj actually had a concept called the ring fence. And the Raj's concept of the ring fence was absolutely remarkable. The ring fence was all around the Indian subcontinent, there would be nothing but subordinate states or buffer states. Because the only power that would be sovereign and paramount would be the Raj. Now, unfortunately, after independence, those buffer states and subordinate states that surrounded India have all become independent, and they've all become important states in their own right. And so India now simply cannot count on having a sanitized frontier without having to work for it. Therefore, Indian foreign policy has to focus a lot on its neighborhood. And it's no surprise that, Prime Minister Modi, like, if you remember Prime Minister Gujral, a good 20 years earlier, focusing more and more on the neighborhood. Because all great powers basically want to make certain that they have peripheries that are non-threatening. The United States sanitized the entire Western Hemisphere after the American Civil War. The Monroe Doctrine was designed to make certain that nobody mucked around in our neck of the woods. India has a similar vision, except that that vision is now subject to intrusion by Chinese power. And Indian weakness is what makes the United States relevant to India. So I tell people, we are condemned to be natural allies. We're condemned to be natural allies because Indian weakness requires countervailing American strength as a balancing power vis-a-vis China. And India's location and India's potential makes India absolutely relevant for the United States. Now, in a purely mechanistic world, if the world was nothing but Newtonian mechanics, right? What would be ideal from our point of view? What would be ideal from our point of view would be something along the following. You have an extremely powerful India that begins to do what Russia did in a previous iteration vis-a-vis China. That is, it is such a powerful concentration of capabilities that the Chinese have to start worrying about the challenges that India poses to China. And if the Chinese start worrying long enough about the challenges that India poses to China, then they don't have the resources and the energy to put into naval forces that one day would operate out here, operate out here, operate out here, and operate out here. In fact, this is the interesting thing about China's maritime expansion. When you look at the history of China's maritime expansion over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, China has moved out to sea. That has gone out and built, navies and maritime forces only about 3 or 4 times. And it's built navies just 3 or 4 times when those 3 conditions that I described earlier obtained. No succession crises, no problems in the north, no domestic disorder. And when China goes out and builds its naval forces, it begins to become a power of international consequence. And when there are crises that suddenly emerge back home, China begins to withdraw from its international engagements and starts looking inward. So today, China is in that phase where it is looking outwards and building military capabilities that will be completely globe-girding. If China is to change course, something must either happen on the inside or something must once again happen on its periphery. Now, for all the attention that the United States pays to power, it's not exactly a Machiavellian state. It does not have the intestinal fortitude to conduct its competition with China by stimulating internal trends, right? So if you were purely Machiavellian, you would begin to say, the Chinese are rising, I need to bring them down a notch or 2, what do I need to do? The first and most obvious thing is, you create enough internal crises in China, and those internal crises will force the Chinese to look inward. It's the most obvious thing that anyone who reads The Prince would come up with. But if we do that, that's a highly risky proposition. And it's not clear that it will succeed. And so the United States is not going to do that. So the sort of alternatives that one has to change China from the inside are going to be very, very difficult. Now, there are many Americans who still hope that if China becomes a democracy, if it begins to become more and more liberal, these threats will disappear. And maybe that's true. And maybe that's true. But no one has quite found the formula for taking China from a party state, really a Leninist party state, and making it into a liberal democracy overnight. And so the internal solutions, whether the internal solutions are peaceful or whether the internal solutions are competitive, those internal solutions appear to lie beyond our reach. And so the only solutions we have are external. And it's in that external universe that India plays such an important role. The vision that the United States has for stability in Asia is not a new vision. I mean, every year you will have a new document issued by the US administration. Those are nothing but exercises in product differentiation. Everyone wants to show that they've come up with a new great idea and they will package it anew and so on and so forth. All the ideas are essentially variants on one old idea. And that old idea is a balance of power within the world island. That's what we need to invest in. And so it's not surprising to me that after the 1991 period began to evolve, the United States and India found themselves in a situation where they had all the conditions for a natural partnership. Because India is struggling for ways to deal with its China challenge. The United States is also struggling for ways to deal with its China challenge. And therefore, US-India relations have dramatically improved. So, have we found sort of have we found the magic solution in India? I would argue not yet. Because for all the convergence that the United States and India have at the political level, there is still a huge weakness in the bilateral relationship. And that weakness is economic. In fact, we are in a very strange universe today, where we have a deep and intensifying rivalry with China. But we also have the deepest economic relations that we've ever had historically with China today. So you have a rivalry with this great power that's rising, And yet you are deeply connected to it in terms of your economic ties and your economic trade. On the other hand, you have a great relationship, a great geopolitical relationship with this other great power that's rising, which is India. But you have very weak economic links. When you look at US-India trade and compare it to US-China trade, US-India trade is minuscule compared to US-China trade. And so the fears that people like me have are that the geopolitics will take you only this far and not beyond a certain threshold. Because at the end of the day, if we cannot convince ourselves that our prosperity depends as much on India as it depends on China, then when push comes to shove, we will always find reason not to do what we would otherwise want to do with India. And so what that tells me is that the task for both our countries in the years and the decades ahead is really to focus on the economic. The strategic parts, there are sort of hiccups, ups and downs, but those are self-connecting. Because nature, as I described it today, nature favors the partnership. It is going to evolve in the right direction without any serious crises, no matter what the perturbations along the way are. But if we don't put the foundations right, and the foundations are always economic, because ultimately, you don't have to be a Marxist to realize that material interests really drive all other interests. And so to the degree that we don't pay attention to repairing the economic foundations of our relationship, to that degree, the US-India relationship will be less robust than it should be. I'm going to end on one final point. At the end of the day, no one can protect American power and American primacy from the outside. No matter how capable a country is. The final obligation of protecting American primacy must be from the inside. That means the United States constantly has to look at a mirror and look at itself. And we have terrific advantages. I mean, I don't need to tell you about those. We have a reasonably large population. We have a demographic profile that is advantageous, second only to India's. We are an extraordinarily wealthy country. We are still the fountainhead of innovation in the global system. We have the world's most powerful military. We spend 10 times more than the next 7 countries combined. So there are terrific advantages that the US has. But the US cannot be in the business of squandering its advantages. We've unfortunately done a very good job of squandering our advantages in recent times. We've got to go back to looking at what is it that made the United States great, right? And that means developing, strengthening our domestic markets, strengthening our human capital base, being open to the best ideas, the best people from the world over. I mean, we are the world's greatest thieves of international human capital. It's called an immigration system, which allows the best and the brightest from the world to come to the United States, make a success for themselves, and actually make a success for us. We've got an openness to ideas in the form of our liberal values. If we lose these, then we lose the real capacity to produce power. So, of course we will rely on India. Of course we will rely on Japan. But those are not substitutes for doing smart things for ourselves. And that's going to be in many ways the biggest challenge that the US faces as it looks to the future. Because these investments abroad, we will continue to make them. But the investments at home sometimes have not enjoyed the political consensus that is necessary for success. So I will end on that note, and I'm happy to take questions in whatever time we have left. So thank you very much for your attention.
Asia answer किसी को नहीं